Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading the last chapter of Queen of Sorcery by David Eddings, Chapter 30. And as always, you should support the original work by buying the original book. Chapter 30. The corridors and vaulted halls of the palace were empty as Aunt Paul led them from the throne room where the eunuchs knelt, chanting their praises to the Serpent Queen. Sword in hand, Barek stalked grimly through the awful carnage that marked the trail he had left when he had entered. The big man's face was pale, and he frequently averted his eyes from some of the more savagely mutilated corpses that littered their way. When they emerged, they found the streets of Thistor darker than night, and filled with hysterical crowds wailing in terror. Barek, with a torch he had taken from the palace wall in one hand and his huge sword in the other, led them into the street. Even in their panic, the Nyassans made way for him. What is this, Polgara? He growled over his shoulder, waving the torch slightly as if to brush the darkness away. Is this some kind of sorcery? No, she answered, it's not sorcery. Tiny flecks of gray were falling through the torchlight. Snow? Barek asked incredulously. No, she said. Ashes. What's burning? A mountain, she replied. Let's go back to the ship as quickly as we can. There's more danger from this crowd than from any of this. She threw her light cloak about Garion's shoulders and pointed down a street where a few torches bobbed here and there. Let's go that way. The ash began to fall more heavily. It was almost like dirty gray flour sifting down through the sodden air, and there was a dreadful sulphurous stink to it. By the time they reached the wharves, the absolute darkness had begun to pale. The ash continued to drift down, seeping into the cracks between the cobblestones and gathering in little windrows along the edges of the buildings. Though it was growing lighter, the falling ash, like fog, blotted out everything more than 10 feet away. The wharves were total chaos. Crowds of Nyassans, shrieking and wailing, were trying to climb into boats to flee from the choking ash that sifted with deadly silence down through the damp air. Mad with terror, many even leaped into the deadly water of the river. We're not going to be able to get through that mob, Polgara, Barek said. Stay here a moment. He sheathed his sword, jumped up, and caught the edge of a low roof. He pulled himself up and stood outlined dimly above them. Ho, Greldick! He roared in a huge voice that carried even over the noise of the crowd. Barek! Greldick's voice came back. Where are you? At the foot of the pier, Barek shouted. We can't get through the crowd. Stay there, Greldick yelled back. We'll come and get you. After a few moments, there was the tramp of heavy feet on the wharf and the occasional sound of blows. A few cries of pain mingled with the sounds of panic from the crowd. Then Greldick, Mandaralin, and a half-dozen burly soldiers, armed with clubs, strode out of the ashfall, clearing a path with brutal efficiency. Did you get lost? Greldick yelled up to Barek. Barek jumped down from the roof. We had to stop by the palace, he answered shortly. We were growing concerned for thy safety, my lady, Mandaralin told Aunt Paul, pushing a gibbering Nyassan out of his way. Good Dernick returned some hours ago. We were delayed, she said. Captain, can you get us on board your ship? Greldick gave her an evil grin. Let's go then, she urged. As soon as we get on board, it might be a good idea to anchor out in the river a little way. This ash will settle after a while, but these people are going to be hysterical until it does. Has there been any word from Silk or my father yet? Nothing, my lady, Greldick said. What is he doing? She demanded irritably of no one in particular. Mandaralin drew his broadsword and marched directly into the face of the crowd, neither slowing nor altering his course. The Nyassans melted out of his path. The crowd, pressing at the edge of the wharf beside Greldick's ship, was even thicker, and Dernick, Hedar, and the rest of the sailors lined the rail with long boat hooks, pushing the terror-stricken people away. Run out the plank, Greldick shouted as they reached the edge of the wharf. Noble captain, a bald Nyassan blubbering clinging to Greldick's fur vest. I'll give you 100 gold pieces if you'll let me aboard your ship. Disgusted, Greldick pushed him away. 1,000 gold pieces! The Nyasin promised, clutching Greldick's arm and waving a purse. Get this baboon off of me! Greldick ordered. One of the sailors casually clubbed the Nyasin into insensibility, then bent and yanked the purse from his grasp. He opened the purse and poured the coins out into one hand. 3 pieces of silver, he said with disgust. All the rest is copper. He turned back and kicked the unconscious man in the stomach. They crossed to the ship one by one, while Barek and Mandaralan held the crowd back with the threat of massive violence. Cut the hawsers, Greldick shouted when they were all aboard. The sailors chopped the thick hawsers loose to a great cry of dismay from the Nyasins crowding the edge of the wharf. The sluggish current pulled the ship slowly away, and the wails and despairing moans followed them as they drifted. Garion, Aunt Paul said, why don't you go below and put on some decent clothes, and wash that disgusting rouge off your face? Then come back up here. I want to talk to you. Garion had forgotten how scantily he was dressed, and he flushed slightly and went back below decks. It had grown noticeably lighter when he came back up, dressed again in tunic and hose, but the gray ash still sifted down through the motionless air, making the world around them hazy and coating everything with a heavy layer of fine grit. They had drifted some distance out into the river, and Greldick's sailors had dropped the anchor. The ship swung slowly in the sluggish current. Over here, Garion, Aunt Paul called. She was standing near the prow, looking out into the dusty haze. Garion went to her a little hesitantly, the memory of what had happened at the palace still strong in his mind. Sit down, dear, she suggested. There's something I have to talk to you about. Yes, ma'am, he said, sitting on the bench there. Garion, she turned to look at him, did anything happen while you were in Selmisra's palace? What do you mean? You know what I mean, she said rather crisply. You're not going to embarrass us both by making me ask certain questions, are you? Oh, Gary blushed. No, nothing like that happened. He remembered the lush overripeness of the Queen with a certain regret. Good. That was the one thing I was afraid of. You can't afford to get involved in any of that sort of thing just yet. It has some peculiar side effects on one in your rather special circumstances. I'm not sure I understand, he said. You have certain abilities, she told him, and if you start experimenting with the other thing before they're fully mastered, the results can sometimes be a bit unpredictable. It's better not to confuse things at this point. Maybe it's better if something had happened then, Garion blurted. Maybe it would have fixed it so I couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I doubt it, she said. Your power is too great to be neutralized so easily. Do you remember what we talked about the day when we left Talnedra? About instruction. I don't need any instruction, he protested, his tone growing sullen. Yes, you do, she said. You need it now. Your power is enormous, more power than I've ever seen before, and some of it is so complex I can't even begin to understand it. You must begin your instruction before something disastrous happens. You're totally out of control, Garion. If you're really serious about not wanting to hurt people, you should be more than willing to start learning how to keep any accidents from happening. I don't want to be a sorcerer, he objected. All I want to do is get rid of it. Can't you help me do that? She shook her head. No, and I wouldn't, even if I could. You can't renounce it, my Garion. It's part of you. Then I'm going to be a monster? Garion demanded bitterly. I'm going to go around burning people alive or turning them into toads or snakes, and maybe after a while I'll get so used to it that it won't even bother me anymore. I'll live forever like you and grandfather, but I won't be human anymore. Aunt Paul, I think I'd rather be dead. Can't you reason with him? Her voice inside his head spoke directly to the other awareness. Not at the moment, Polgara, the dry voice replied. He's too busy wallowing in self-pity. He must learn to control the power he has, she said. I'll keep him out of mischief, the voice promised. I don't think there's much else we can do until Belgarath gets back. He's going through a moral crisis, and we can't really tamper with him until he works out his own solutions to it. I don't like seeing him suffering this way. You're too tender-hearted, Polgara. He's a sturdy boy, and a bit of suffering won't damage him. Will the two of you stop treating me as if I'm not even here? Gary demanded angrily. Mistress Paul, Dernick said, coming across the deck to them, I think you'd better come quickly. Barek's going to kill himself. He what? It's something about some curse, Dernick explained. He says he's going to fall on his sword. That idiot! Where is he? He's back by the stern, Dernick said. He's got his sword out, and he won't let anybody near him. Come with me. She started toward the stern, with Garion and Dernick behind her. We have all experienced battle madness, my lord, Mandaralin was saying, trying to reason with the big Sherrick. It is not a thing of which to be proud, but neither is it a cause for such bleak despair. Barek did not answer, but stood at the very stern of the ship, his eyes blank with horror and his huge sword weaving in a slow, menacing arc, holding everyone at bay. Aunt Paul walked through the crowd of sailors and directly up to him. Don't try to stop me, Polgara, he warned. She reached out quite calmly and touched the point of his sword with one finger. It's a little dull, she said thoughtfully. Why don't we have Dernick sharpen it? That way it'll slip more smoothly through your ribs when you fall on it. Barek looked a bit startled. Have you made all the necessary arrangements? She asked. What arrangements? For the disposal of your body, she told him. Really, Barek, I thought you had better manners. A decent man doesn't burn into his friends with that kind of a chore, she thought for a moment. Burning is customary, I suppose, but the wood here in Nyissa is very soggy. You'd probably smolder for a week or more. I imagine we'll have to settle for just dumping you in the river. The leeches and crayfish should have stripped you to bone in a day or so. Barek's expression grew hurt. Do you want us to take your sword and shield back to your son? She asked. I don't have a son, he answered sullenly. He was obviously not prepared for her brutal practicality. Oh, didn't I tell you? How forgetful of me. What are you talking about? Never mind, she said. It's not important now. Were you just going to fall on your sword, or would you prefer to run up against the mast with the hilt? Either way works rather well. She turned to the sailors. Would you clear a path so the Earl of Trailham can get a good run at the mast? The sailors stared at her. What did you mean about a son? Barek asked, lowering his sword. It would only unsettle your mind, Barek, she answered. You'd probably make a mess of killing yourself if I told you about it. We'd really rather not have you lying around groaning for weeks on end. That sort of thing is so depressing, you know. I want to know what you're talking about. Oh, very well, she said with a great sigh. Your wife, Meryl, is with child, the result of certain courtesies you exchanged when we visited Val Alorn, I imagine. She looks like a rising moon at the moment, and your lusty brat is making her life miserable with his kicking. A son? Barek said, his eyes suddenly very wide. Really, Barek, she protested, you must learn to pay attention. You'll never make anything of yourself if you keep blundering around with your ears closed like this. A son? He repeated, his sword sliding out of his fingers. Now you've dropped it, she chided him. Pick it up immediately, and then let's get on with it. It's very inconsiderate of you to take all day to kill yourself like this. I'm not going to kill myself, he told her indignantly. You're not? Of course not, he spluttered, and then he saw the faint flicker of a smile playing about the corners of her mouth. He hung his head sheepishly. You great fool, she said. Then she took hold of his beard with both hands, pulled his head down, and kissed his ash-dusted face soundly. Greldick began to chortle, and Mandaralin stepped forward and caught Barek in a rough embrace. I rejoice with thee, my friend, he said. My heart soars for thee. Bring up a cask, Greldick told the sailors, pounding on his friend's back. We'll salute Trailham's heir with the bright brown ale of timeless Sherrick. I expect this will get rowdy now, Aunt Paul said quietly to Garion. Come with me. She led the way back toward the ship's prow. Will she ever change back? Garion asked when they were alone again. What? The Queen, Garion explained. Will she ever change back again? In time, she won't even want to, Aunt Paul answered. The shapes we assume begin to dominate our thinking after a while. As the years go by, she'll become more and more a snake and less a woman. Garion shuddered. It would have been kinder to have killed her. I promised Lord Issa that I wouldn't, she said. Was that really the god? His spirit, she replied, looking out into the hazy ashfall. Some Misra infused the statue with Issa's spirit. For a time, at least, the statue was the god. It's all very complicated. She seemed a bit preoccupied. Where is he? She seemed suddenly irritated. Who? Father! He should have been here days ago. They stood together looking out at the muddy river. Finally, she turned from the railing and brushed at the shoulders of her cloak with distaste. The ash puffed from under her fingers in tiny clouds. I'm going below, she told him, making a face. It's just too dirty up here. I thought you wanted to talk to me, he said. I don't think you're ready to listen. It'll wait. She stepped back, then stopped. Oh, Garion. Yes? I wouldn't drink any of that ale the sailors are swilling. After what they made you drink at the palace, it would probably make you sick. Oh, he agreed a trifle regretfully. All right. It's up to you, of course, she said. But I thought you ought to know. Then she turned again and went to the hatch and disappeared down the stairs. Garion's emotions were turbulent. The entire day had been vastly eventful, and his mind was filled with a welter of confused images. Be quiet, the voice in his mind said. What? I'm trying to hear something. Listen. Listen to what? There, can't you hear it? Faintly, as if from a very long way off, Garion seemed to hear a muffled thudding. What is it? The voice did not answer, but the amulet about his neck began to throb in time with the distant thudding. Behind him, he heard a rush of tiny feet. Garion! He turned in time to be caught in Sinedra's embrace. I was so worried about you. Where did you go? Some men came on board and grabbed me, he said, trying to untangle himself from her arms. They took me to the palace. How awful, she said. Did you meet the queen? Garion nodded and then shuddered, remembering the hooded snake lying on the divan, looking at itself in the mirror. What's wrong? The girl asked. A lot of things happened, he answered. Some of them weren't very pleasant. Somewhere at the back of his awareness, the thudding continued. Do you mean they tortured you? Sinedra asked, her eyes growing very wide. No, nothing like that. Well, what happened? She demanded. Tell me. He knew that she would not leave him alone until he did, so he described what had happened as best he could. The throbbing sound seemed to grow louder while he talked, and his right palm began to tingle. He rubbed at it absently. How absolutely dreadful, Sinedra said after he had finished. Weren't you terrified? Not really, he told her, still scratching at his palm. Most of the time, the things they made me drink made my head so foggy I didn't feel anything. Did you really kill Moss? She asked. Just like that? She snapped her fingers. It wasn't exactly just like that, he tried to explain. There was a little more to it. I knew you were a sorcerer, she said. I told you that you were the one the day at the pool, remember? I don't want to be, he protested. I didn't ask to be. I didn't ask to be a princess either. It's not the same. Being a king or a princess is what one is. Being a sorcerer has to do with what one does. I really don't see much difference, she objected stubbornly. I can make things happen, he told her. Awful things, usually. So? She said maddeningly. I can make awful things happen too, or at least I could back in Tall Hanif. One word from me could have sent a servant to the whipping post or to the headsman's block. I didn't do it, of course, but I could have. Power is power, Garion. The results are the same. You don't have to hurt people if you don't want to. It just happens sometimes. It's not that I want to do it. The throbbing had become a nagging thing, almost like a dull headache. Then you have to learn to control it. Now you sound like Aunt Paul. She's trying to help you, the princess said. She keeps trying to get you to do what you're going to have to do eventually anyway. How many people are you going to have to burn up before you finally accept what she says? You didn't have to say that. Garion was stung deeply by her words. Yes, she told him. I think I did. You're lucky I'm not your aunt. I wouldn't put up with your foolishness the way Lady Polgara does. You don't understand, Garion muttered sullenly. I understand much better than you think, Garion. You know what your problem is? You don't want to grow up. You want to keep on being a boy forever. You can't, though. Nobody can. No matter how much power you have. Whether you're an emperor or a sorcerer, you can't stop the years from going by. I realized that a long time ago, but then I'm probably much smarter than you are. Then, without any kind of explanation, she raised up on her toes and kissed him lightly on the lips. Garion blushed and lowered his head in embarrassment. Tell me, Sinadra said, toying with the sleeve of his tunic, was Queen Selmisra as beautiful as they say? She was the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life, Garion answered without thinking. The princess caught her breath sharply. I hate you! She cried from between clenched teeth. Then she turned and ran sobbing in search of Aunt Paul. Garion stared after her in perplexity. He turned then to stare moodily out at the river and the drifting ash. The tingling in his palm was becoming intolerable, and he scratched at it, digging his fingernails in. You'll just make it sore, the voice in his mind said. It itches. I can't stand it. Stop being a baby. What's causing it? Do you mean to say you really don't know? You've got further to go than I thought. Put your right hand on the amulet. Why? Just do it, Garion. Garion reached inside his tunic and put his burning palm on his medallion. As a key fitting into the lock for which it was made, the contact between his hand and the throbbing amulet seemed somehow enormously tight. The tingling became the now familiar surge, and the throbbing began to echo hollowly in his ears. Not too much, the voice warned. You're not trying to dry up the river, you know. What's happening? What is all this? Belgarath's trying to find us. Grandfather? Where? Be patient. The throbbing seemed to grow louder until Garion's entire body quivered with each thudding beat. He stared out over the rail, trying to see through the haze. The settling ash, so light that it coated the muddy surface of the river, made everything more than 20 paces away indistinct. It was impossible to see the city, and the wails and cries from the hidden streets seemed somehow muffled. Only the slow wash of the current against the hull seemed clear. Then, a long way out on the river, something moved. It was not very large, and it seemed to be little more than a dark shadow, ghosting silently with the current. The throbbing grew even louder. The shadow drew closer, and Garion could just begin to make out the shape of a small boat. An oar caught the surface of the water with a small splash. The man at the oars turned to look over his shoulder. It was Silk. His face was covered with gray ash, and tiny rivulets of sweat streaked his cheeks. Mr. Wolf sat in the stern of the little boat, muffled in his cloak and with his hood turned up. Welcome back, Belgarath, the dry voice said. Who's that? Wolf's voice in Garion's mind sounded startled. Is that you, Belgarion? Not quite, the voice replied. Not yet, anyway. But we're getting closer. I wondered who was making all that noise. He overdoes things sometimes. He'll learn eventually. A shout came from one of the sailors clustered around Barek at the stern, and they all turned to watch the small boat drifting toward them. Aunt Paul came up from below and stepped to the rail. You're late, she called. Something came up, the old man answered across the narrowing gap. He pushed back his hood and shook the floury ash out of his cloak. Then Garion saw the old man's left arm was bound up in a dirty sling across the front of his body. What happened to your arm? Aunt Paul asked. I'd rather not talk about it. There was an ugly scratch running down one of Wolf's cheeks into his short white beard, and his eyes seemed to glitter with some huge irritation. The grin on Silk's ash-coated face was malicious as he dipped his oars once, deftly pulling the little boat in beside Greldic's ship with a slight thump. I can't imagine you can be persuaded to keep your mouth shut, Wolf said irritably to the small man. Would I say anything, mighty sorcerer? Silk asked mockingly, his ferret eyes wide with feigned innocence. Just help me aboard, Wolf told him, his voice testy. His entire bearing was that of a man who had been mortally insulted. Whatever you say, ancient Belgarath, Silk said, obviously trying to keep from laughing. He steadied Wolf as the old man awkwardly climbed over the ship's rail. Let's just get out of here, Mr. Wolf curtly told Captain Greldick, who had just joined them. Oh, which way, Ancient One? Greldick asked carefully, clearly not wanting to aggravate the old man further. Wolf stared hard at him. Upstream or downstream? Greldick explained mollifyingly. Upstream, of course, Wolf snapped. How was I supposed to know? Greldick appealed to Aunt Paul. Then he turned and crossly began barking orders to his sailors. Aunt Paul's expression was a peculiar mixture of relief and curiosity. I'm sure your story is going to be absolutely fascinating, Father, she said as the sailors began raising the heavy anchors. I simply can't wait to hear it. I can do without the sarcasm, Paul, Wolf told her. I've had a very bad day. Try not to make it any worse. The last was finally too much for Silk. The little man, in the act of climbing across the rail, suddenly collapsed in helpless glee. He tumbled forward to the deck, howling with laughter. Mr. Wolf glared at the laughing companion with a profoundly affronted expression as Greldick's sailors ran out their oars and began turning the ship in the sluggish current. What happened to your arm, Father? Aunt Paul's gaze was penetrating, and her tone was quite clearly that she did not intend to be put off any longer. I broke it, Wolf told her flatly. How did you manage that? It was just a stupid accident, Paul. These things happen sometimes. Let me see it. In a moment. He scowled at Silk, who was still laughing. Will you stop that? Go tell the sailors where we're going. Where are we going, Father? Aunt Paul asked him. Did you find Zadar's trail? He crossed into Thalmergo's. Two-Chick was waiting for him. And the orb? Two-Chick's got it now. Are we going to be able to cut him off before he gets to Rakthal with it? I doubt it. Anyway, we have to go to the Vale first. The Vale? Father, you're not making any sense. Our master summoned us, Paul. He wants us at the Vale, so that's where we're going. What about the orb? Two-Chick's got it, and I know where to find Two-Chick. He isn't going anyplace. For right now, we're going to the Vale. All right, Father, she concurred placatingly. Don't excite yourself. She looked at him closely. Have you been fighting, Father? She asked dangerously. No, I haven't been fighting. He sounded disgusted. What happened then? A tree fell on me. What? You heard me. Silk exploded into fresh howls of mirth at the old man's grudging confession. From the stern of the ship, where Greldick and Barek stood at the tiller, the slow beat of the drum began, and the sailors dug in with their oars. The ship slid through the oily water, moving upstream against the current, with Silk's laughter trailing behind in the ashen-laden air.